Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first session of 2023. I'm so glad we're going to feature Augie during this session. We're actually having two demo days coming up in the next few months. Our EMEA demo day is on March 16th. It's going to be held at Google's headquarters in London. And we're also going to have an APAC specific demo day in May. So please join us for that if you're an investor, if you want to see what the demo days are like, or if you're a founder that wants to actually go and attend and pitch, please reach out to demoday@xoogler.co. But what we're going to cover today is what needs to be in a pitch deck. I'm so glad to actually have my friend who is going to go through a few slides. I'm going to have an open Q&A Augie afterwards if any specific questions, but we'll at least make this recording available for those who aren't able to join us live. So before I actually turn it over to the presentation part, Augie, would you mind doing an introduction about yourself and so that the audience knows who you are and why we invited you to speak to all of us today?
Yes, no, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me, Chris. Very quickly from my side, guys, my name is Augie Augustus, more formally, but most people call me Augie. I'm originally from the US, born and raised, went to school at Stanford for undergrad and master's, but I've been based in Asia for the better part of 8 years, almost a decade now. First 4 years with McKinsey, working across Southeast Asia and Latin America markets. Second half with Sequoia Capital based in Singapore. With Sequoia, I started off more as a general seed investor covering all sectors in Southeast Asia. I was also a part of our Surge program, which you can think about as our early stage accelerator program for seed stage founders across India and Southeast Asia. Very similar to ARC for those of you in the US or Europe. It's Sequoia's program for those markets, but preceded ARC by 2-3 years. Afterwards, I fell down the crypto rabbit hole and, in late 2020 was leading most of our crypto work across the Southeast Asia region, across all categories, DeFi, NFTs, infra, layer ones. So that's a long-winded way of saying I should hopefully know a little bit of something about fundraising, or at the very least, I've seen a lot of pitches. And so what I'm hoping to share with you today is some of the best practices from those, maybe some of the pitfalls to avoid. And yeah, as Chris mentioned, happy to have an open discussion after that.
Awesome. Thank you. And the best part about this is Augie just finished his stint with Sequoia on December 31st last year, right? So we can even ask you more intimate questions now.
That's right. That's correct.
So let's go into it. Augie, do you want to put up a presentation, or should we just kickstart with some of the questions that have come in already?
Sounds good. Let me share my screen and we can go from there.
Great.
1 second here, guys. Sorry, can you guys see my screen? Perfect. Sorry, let's get myself organized here. All right, you guys can see just the presentation, right? Not the notes? Yep. Perfect. Let's get started. I already went through my background. We can skip this part. Let's get into it, guys. So I think the high-level intent of this session, as I mentioned, was to share with you kind of the core building blocks that I would suggest having in any pitch deck, some frameworks and mindsets and in terms of how to structure those pieces together. And then, of course, lots and lots of examples, which will hopefully bring some of these aspects to life. So let's start with the ingredients, right? And this is a pretty straightforward list that I imagine is not too different from what many of you would have seen from maybe Sequoia content or other folks that recommend different parts of a pitch deck to include. But they are the building blocks. So let's start from here and maybe speak about each of these before diving into some of the frameworks, right? So first is the hook. What does the hook mean? The hook can be many things, but it's typically a page that would demonstrate some of the more interesting things about your company and attract the investor's interest. If you have metrics or traction, you'll put those forward. Series A decks will typically lead with 4 to 6 of your strongest metrics to really grab the attention of the user or the audience member. And hopefully also succinctly describe what your company does, let's say, in a single sentence. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be your mission and vision. If, let's say, you don't have metrics to show, it could be something else, maybe context setting on the market. But really grabbing the audience's attention in what is a very short presentation and a short span of time is critically important. Number 2, the market shift. So this is more about not the size and structure yet. You see that might come later, but more what is the shift or the innovation that is opening up a substantial opportunity within that market? Another way of asking it is like, what's the why now in this instance? Maybe the market has existed for decades, with certain structures and certain players around for several years. But what about today suggests that your business should exist, right? Why now? 3 gets into the problem. So what is the pain or the opportunity that this aforementioned change leads to, like creates for your customer, right? So what are the shortcomings for existing market solutions, which obviously leads very nicely into number 4, what's the solution or the product that you yourself are building? The key here on this one is clarity and crispness, right? So very succinctly and hopefully in a very visual fashion, showing how your solution solves the pain point in a unique way and how it delivers value. 5th, the business model. This is more around creating and capturing value. You can also talk about in this section, go-to-market, monetization strategy, these sorts of things. 6th, traction, right? These can be both operating and financial metrics, P&L, and let's say the MIS, things like transactions, users, etc. The idea is to demonstrate some early signs or maybe great signs of product market fit. And aside, I think, from top line growth, customer love, those sorts of things, later on, especially Series A and beyond, unit economics also becomes pretty relevant. What's the quality of that revenue? All of this stuff we'll dive into later. I'm running past it very quickly for the sake of this page, but that's traction. The next item is vision, right? So like the thinking here is, if all goes well, what will you have built in 5 years, right? What is the transformation that your company and your users will undergo as you achieve that vision? 8th, this is maybe market in the way that you guys would think about the market. So what is the size? What is the structure? You guys mentioned TAM at the beginning. We'll get into that in just a second. But not just size, but the structure of the market, right? Where are the profit and revenue pools, and what are the inefficiencies that you can potentially capture as a young upstart? 9, competition. So who competes with you with that who competes with you for that aforementioned market, both directly and indirectly, and what's your differentiation or plan to win versus those competitors? Finally, we can't forget the team, right? So do you have the right team to execute and win? Tell the story of your founding team and demonstrate what we call founder market fit, as well as product market fit. So these are the ingredients, right? And it obviously is not maybe the best practice to just list these in any particular order. But let's first, before discussing like how to bucket them, like discuss why these things. And I think the very simple way to think about it is you're basically answering each holistic, basic, one-word question that could be asked about your business, right? Starting with why. Why are we doing what we're doing? Well, that really is comprised of the why now and the problem. It's a meaty, massive problem for your users. That's why you're doing it. The next question is what, right? Well, what is specifically the product that you're building and the business model in which it operates? How you will get there, or how you are getting there, is obviously the traction or the evidence that you're starting to provide. Team obviously relates very directly to who. For the astute audience members, you might think the next question is when. It is not when. Sorry, I'm breaking the framework. But what's next, right? Forward-looking, thinking about the vision, the market that you're looking to capture, and the competition that might react to some of the moves that you're making. So this, again, is just context. But the reason these 10 ingredients exist is that we're trying to address 5 holistic questions around the business that you are building. I also want to talk a bit about this mindset of making pitch decks, right? Because I think there is in my experience, there's a tendency to produce 2 different types. There is the very data-driven, lots of numbers, charts, those types of pitch decks. And then there's the more emotive storytelling type pitch decks. And there's usually, you'll fall on one end of the spectrum or the other. That's oftentimes one of the pitfalls that I'll see. And I think in reality, what's a more helpful mindset for you as founders to employ is it is a spectrum. And there should be elements of both that you should include in your pitch deck without succumbing to the pitfalls of the extremes, right? If you're too data-driven, too many charts, inundated with data, you will lose the attention of the reader, or you may be being categorized as an incremental innovation as opposed to truly a step change. If you're too emotive, too much storytelling without enough data, maybe that feels a bit fluffy to the audience or to the leader, or a bit naive, right? Like, where are the numbers is maybe something that the investor might be thinking in the back of their head. And so again, this is a conceptual page, but the idea is try to think about both of these elements as you craft your pitch deck. So let's get into the meat of the content, guys, and I'll use this framing as we get into some of the principles and some of the examples, right? As I mentioned earlier, you don't want to just list out the 10 elements. There are various ways in which you can structure these elements so that it makes a cohesive story. This is one example, and the way that I bucketed these bullets, which you can see map fairly nicely, almost one-to-one to the ones prior. Maybe there's some subcategorization going on here, but I bucketed it into 4 different chapters, right? I might start with the context, and the context consists of the hook. It consists of the market context. It consists of the answer to the why now question, and maybe it tees up the problem statement. You understand the market, you understand why. This is the hairy, meaty problem. Chapter 2, what am I building? You start maybe a bit generically, or generically is not the right word, but from a value proposition perspective. I don't yet talk about my products and features, but I talk about the value proposition those products and features are delivering almost on a one-to-one mapping basis with my problem. From there, I get into my solutions, like I said, in a very visual fashion. I talk about the personas or the customers that I'm serving, and I get into certain core features for those personas. You understand my product. Now let's talk about what I've achieved thus far with that product. As I mentioned, there might be 3 or 4 key areas that you want to address here. One is top line growth, can be financial, can be operating metrics. One is customer love in some form or fashion. In the early days, that might be something as straightforward as an NPS, or even just quotes can be very powerful. Later on, it will probably be retention cohorts or something of that sort. And then unit economics or quality of revenue. Again, we'll go through some examples a little bit later. Finally, you've understood the performance of my business. You've understood what I'm building. Let me tell you about where I'm going next, right? And here I'll talk about the longer term business model, what I'm hoping to achieve from a product roadmap perspective, but also tangibly metrics, what milestones I want to hit. And I cap it off with why I think I'm the right team for the job. So this is one structure. It's not the only structure, but this is what we'll use to kind of go through the examples and show you how you can craft your story. So let's start with context. A few principles before we get into the examples, right? I think the context section in my mind, it always starts with story, right? The idea is fourfold, right? We want to, again, grab the audience attention with a hook, and we'll see a hook in just a second. We want to answer that why now question. We want to describe the magnitude of the problem and explain that this is something worth solving. And we want to tee up what that ideal state looks like for your product section. I'll borrow a storytelling framework that actually one of my colleagues from Sequoia used to use to great effect, which is, if we're starting with story, if we want this section to be probably the most emotive chapter of the entire presentation, well, how do we tell stories, right? There might be maybe a 5-part framework that we can use here. You first describe the market shift. What is the shift that's happening? You get into the problem, like what's the impact of that shift? You can then point to the promised land. What does that ideal state look like that you're trying to get to? You talk about your company's magic gifts. So that's how your company takes the customer to that ideal state, that promised land. And then you talk about the journey, the transformation for a customer, the from to, and what's the end state. That's a very simple storytelling framework, but let's see how that's applied in practice. So first, I want to give you this example, which is of the hook page. All of these examples, by the way, are from companies that I've worked with in the past and who have graciously offered, obviously in a sanitized fashion, to share some of their presentations with us. So here's an example of a hook page from a company that I used to work with called Tinvio. Tinvio, for those of you that know the Western comps, is something like a Choco or a Recce, basically a chat-based order management solution for food and beverage merchants, primarily SMEs in most instances, but in this instance for Asia. And as you can see here, the hook page is pretty straightforward. What the founder did was identify 6 core metrics that he felt would put his business best foot forward, and that were most core to demonstrating early product market fit. I've obviously sanitized this for the sake of this discussion, but you can see very crisp, very clean, grabs the user's attention when I talk about thousands of active merchants, hundreds of millions of annualized total order value, tens of millions of TPV, adding several hundred merchants every single month, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of a hook that I think has been quite effective. The reason, again, to do this, just to summarize, is I think investors they tend to be inherently impatient. And so satisfying their need for numbers early is oftentimes constructive. Get them hooked, get them excited to learn more. The work to be done here is obviously identifying what those 3 to 5 key metrics are for your business and for your sector that investors would hope to see. So that's the hook page. Let's see an example of maybe this market shift to problem to to value prop type flow. This is another company that I used to work with while at Sequoia. It's called ScanPay. They're in the digital payment space. Basically, it's a QR-based payment solution for professional services merchants in the US. So think plumbers, carpenters, those sorts of home workers could use ScanPay to basically accept payments from their customers. So the flow for ScanPay would go something like this, right? First, the market shift. We live in a world today, obviously, where businesses are rapidly adopting digital payments. You can see here the scorecard from what could be in every coffee shop in the US. We're inundated with payment options, and I mean that in the best way possible. There are various different digital methods that we've started to use as consumers, whether they're wallets, credit cards, payment apps, that have very quickly displaced fiat at the checkout counter. But, and here's the problem, that digital transformation has not been uniform. We see it very pointedly in certain categories and in certain formats. It's noticeably absent from others, right? In in-store retail, the example that I gave with the coffee shop, it's probably the most clear, right? We've seen this transformation from cash to a digital terminal powered by providers like Square. We've also seen this on the online retail front, right? Where very quickly bank transfers have been replaced by payment gateway providers like Stripe. And it's not sort of an early transformation. For both of these categories, I would say 80–85% plus penetration is very common. Where we lag behind is in offline services, the segment that I was describing to earlier. Home service providers who today largely still transact and receive payments via fiat or check. There is still not that equivalent in this category, and that's the problem that we're looking to solve. This gets into the problem a little bit further. I won't spend too much time here, but the takeaway from this page is basically to say payments today in home services, that third column that I mentioned, is horrendous. And it links to 4 key pain points. You can see how many steps there are just to go through this payment process for your typical homeowner today. I'm sure this resonates with many of you who've ever engaged a carpenter or a plumber, etc., for your home. It's slow, it's manual, it's a one-size-fits-all process, and there's no good alternative for SMBs, right? There's hardware products, but it doesn't perfectly fit the needs of this specific user who maybe has multiple carpenters within a 5-person shop. Does each one of them need to carry a hardware device? And so on and so forth, right? The pain point is massive. So imagine, right, a solution that was tailor-fit for SMBs, accessible right from your mobile phone, and addresses all of these key pain points. It's frictionless, QR code based. It's instant, payment happens instantaneously. It's flexible in the sense that you can use multiple payment methods. And it's holistic, right? It's not just about payments, but users, the merchants, right, can set up checking accounts and even virtual debit cards so that their providers can start to spend to cover some of their OpEx costs, let's say after a job. That's the end of the section, but hopefully it gives you a sense of kind of how this flow would work. The market shift, the problem, maybe further elaboration of the problem, and then I tee it up. Imagine if, right? Last example I want to give you guys for this context setting section is a third company, and this is more around the market, right? I know there were some few questions around this, right? So for the market, I think there's a few ways to go about this, right? But obviously the most tried and true framework that you guys alluded to earlier is TAM and SAM, right? And I think, this company, that is another example from a company that I used to work with. It's in the advertising SaaS space. Basically what they do is they help brands who sell via horizontal e-commerce platforms like, let's say, Amazon, but in Asia, optimize their ad spend in platform. So bidding on keywords within the Amazon ecosystem or Shopee or Lazada or what have you. So what we did here is basically we triangulated in a very top-down fashion what their TAM and SAM would be, starting with the overall digital ad spend globally, which is $30 billion. From there, the way you think about TAM is what is the total addressable market, obviously, which is not necessarily taking into account your capabilities as a company today, but if you were to take the global market for this type of product, what is the dollar value that you could potentially capture? That is $9 billion for this company, which takes into account not just the integrations that they've made so far with local Southeast Asia marketplaces, the 4 companies here, not just the 8 that they plan to integrate with, but basically every single regional market in emerging countries. That's what they've defined it as their geographic scope, and hence that's their dollar TAM. The SAM is the subset of that. It's basically the 8 integrations that they have planned plus the 4 that they already have in place That's $2 billion today. And so take a step back. There's a numbers exercise here to be done, obviously, and I hope that gave some instruction in terms of how you should think about that piece. But the intent of this page is the following. Thumb rule is like $1 billion SAM and beyond is a large enough market opportunity to be venture backable, because a $1 billion market can yield a $100 million business fairly straightforwardly, let's say, as the thumb rule. And a $100 million business revenue run rate could, at a 10x multiple, yield a unicorn, and that's the thumb rule that a lot of investors are going for. So I think as long as you kind of hit that order of magnitude threshold, that's probably the biggest thing, at least from a sizing perspective. Later on, we get into some of the more nuances around market structure, competition, etc. But hopefully this example is helpful. So that is the context section. Like I said, guys, feel free to interrupt me at any point. Otherwise, we can also do Q&As at the end once we stop recording. But let's get into the second chapter, product. Principles here. I think the core phrase is show, don't tell. It's really about demonstrating as visually as possible and an as real-time basis as possible what it is that you're building. Right? I think a picture here or a screenshot or even a mock-up tells 1,000 words. A demo, like 1,000,000 words, right? It's always preferable to the extent you can manage given the technical setup. Maybe it's virtual, so it might be challenging. But a demo is usually the best way to do this. I think the second best option is like a voiced over recording of a demo can oftentimes be quite effective. Or maybe it's a demo without any narration and you narrate it live. That can also be nice. If not, then screenshots. You also want to articulate your value proposition very clearly and succinctly and outline the key features and broader product architecture. Finally, you should talk about your secret sauce, like why, what is your key differentiation and why you in what might be a crowded market. So let's see maybe one example here. This is, again, the company from before, Tinvio. We're skipping, obviously, the upfront section for the sake of brevity, but you can assume they're talking about how the interactions between food and beverage merchants and their supply chain is horrendous. It's manual. It's across many different platforms. Now let's talk about the product, right? We've built a super intuitive chat-based product to harmonize the interactions between merchants and their suppliers. And what they talk about on this page, maybe it's a little bit crowded. Maybe he might have each screenshot on a separate page, but we go through the core features of the product, right? There is real-time communication where you can chat with all your suppliers in one place. There is a simple ordering system where you can order anytime, anywhere with the click of a button. There is a centralized order management where you can consolidate and track past orders and critical business insights to optimize expenses and cash flows down the road. So that's the product and the features. Then he gets into customers. And I think this is more a stylistic choice. I love this page. It's not for everyone. You might choose a different format. But the narration and the voiceover of this page is the most important. It says, listen, these are our customers. We serve a variety of different types of personas, ranging from mom and pop, 1-2 man or woman shows, to SMBs, to mid-market, to even enterprise. And we've demonstrated strong product market fit and customer love across each one of these segments. He might talk about how certain features have resonated for different segments, how they've built certain product features to cater to new customer needs. But the point is, you make this very real, you show these are real users, and you describe a little bit some of the customer love that exists. From here, he breaks at least my flow a little bit by talking a little bit about what's next from a product roadmap perspective, right? And the idea here, or the voiceover, goes something like, we've expanded on the core value proposition, which is a single app for every single order, to then get into first digital invoicing, which pairs very nicely, obviously, with the chat management function. We place an order, not let me then issue an invoice or a request for an invoice. Finally, into financial services, right? Which start off with digital payments, enabling that from within the app. And then finally, other types of financial services, like, let's say, credit financing for suppliers or buyers. And that's really our secret sauce as a business, right? That's our winning formula. We start off with an incredibly sticky product, a free chat-based app that customers love. And from there, we layer on other B2B payments, credit services, basically recurring payments and financing solutions to really lock in our users and create what is a full stack B2B transactions application. So that is an example of the product section. Let me just check where we are for time. Okay, so far so good. Traction. All right, so I think this is obviously addressing the fact that, hey, the proof is ultimately in the pudding in some instances. And we want to demonstrate with real numbers some of the things that we mentioned prior, some of the, add some meat to the storytelling that we've done prior. So the work here, as I already alluded to, so I won't dwell on, is identifying your killer metrics. I think you don't need to boil the ocean. You don't need to show every single metric. You just need one or two strong ones to start. Leverage case studies, I think, where applicable and where relevant. And try to put your best foot forward, right? I think there's always this dynamic when I see pitch decks getting made where, like, should I include or should I not include this metric? It's probably not my best metric. It's sort of middling, or maybe it tells a story that I don't want to tell about my business. Do I include it or do I not include it? That's a tough question to answer. I think my personal opinion is there are certain metrics that you must always include no matter the story that they're telling. Those are things like top line or MRR, ARR in the case of a SaaS business. And there's some that you can, like, are more secondary metrics that you can consider, excluding, at least for the, in the context of a 12-page deck. But for those metrics that you include, even if they're not telling the story that you want to tell, I think there's always context that can be provided. That doesn't mean obfuscate the truth. It means, let's say revenue dipped in this particular quarter, but then went back up. You circle it, you pull a call out, and you explain what happened in that month and how that's being addressed. Something of that nature to, again, put your best foot forward. The last point I was alluding to a little bit already, but like, I definitely don't suggest being cute. What I mean by that is I've also seen another strategy employed in pitch deck making, which is I will fudge with the formatting to try to put my best foot forward. So like the classic example here is revenue in month versus cumulative. Right, and because what happens is if you show cumulative revenue, which is basically last month's revenue plus whatever I earned this month, that's the bar that I'll show, it's always increasing, or it's at least flat by definition. While that's not a red flag or even a yellow flag, it is very annoying, I think, as an investor to see that. And the most savvy ones will point that out, and you'll get into this broader discussion, and it just obfuscates the truth on like what is actually going on with your business. So I don't recommend that. That's not what I mean by putting your best foot forward. Don't be too cute, right? I think really the traction section, I think for Series A decks, for example, should cover three main things. Should show growth across your core metrics. It can be financial, like revenue. It can be operational, like customers, users, transactions, maybe even engagement. You should show some form of customer love in the form of NPS or feedback or cohorts. And then you should talk about monetization, which is basically unit economics, willingness to pay, and how those metrics are transitioning over time. So let's get into it with maybe one example. So this comes from another company called Virtual Internships. Virtual Internships, what they do is that they are a SaaS-enabled marketplace for, as the name would suggest, virtual internship experiences. So what that means is I, as a student, would be paired with a business. Let's say I'm in Singapore, it's a business in the US virtually. And over the summer, I would be paired with a manager and go and basically be assigned a project as a virtual intern for that particular company. So it's a really interesting business. And their traction section might look something like this. So, to start, we've seen really strong revenue growth over the last 2 years. I think 2019 to 2020 was a bit slow. We were still getting our go-to-market function up and running. At that point, it was pretty much founder-led sales. But really, the business started to inflect around 2021. We grew almost 10 times from 2020 to 2021 in terms of top line. And we're forecasting to grow more than two times by this calendar year, despite the macro headwinds. That's on the back of some really strong university partnerships, right? I mean, take a look at some of the logos here. I would say the who's who of US universities, UCLA, Penn, Harvard, Oregon, but we also have a very strong presence in other markets. You can see here representation from Europe, from Australia, and we're making inroads in Australia as well. The broad feedback, as you can see from this quote here, is that our value proposition is well received by these partners, with strong tailwinds from COVID and this broader shift to remote work. It's not just our universities that love us, but our students too. And I won't get into the quotes here, but obviously the point of this is to say our students love us. The feedback is great. The reason for that is we drive strong strong program outcomes. Roughly a third of historical batches and interns have been offered a position, a full-time position after their internship. Almost 100% of interns who began their virtual internship have completed it, almost 100% completion rate. 90% plus of interns agree that this was a valuable experience. and roughly 80% plus agree that they're more confident in future employment, right? These are obviously stellar outcomes. And finally, and I think this is more, thinking about our Series A and beyond, we're growing, but we're growing in a very sustainable manner, right? You can see here, I removed the numbers for this discussion, but you can see here on an LTV CAC basis, which we identified as one of the key metrics for virtual internships, we're bringing in over the course of the lifetime of a customer, much more than it costs us to acquire them, right? For the typical B2B partner, the CAC as such, lifetime revenues on a gross profit margin basis is almost 7.5 times that because of how strong our value proposition is and because of how long these customers are staying with us. Cool. So that is the example for the traction section. I will wrap up here with what's next. So the principles. Again, it's about painting the vision, right? I think as I've tried to highlight earlier, the suggestion here is to address some of the questions and concerns as sort of next steps in this section. What do I mean by that, right? There have been examples where, let's say, you are a flow-based business, a marketplace. You capture GMV and you take some take rate from that. Maybe it's early days and you have strong GMV flows. That's the metric you're showing as top line growth, but very little to show in terms of actual value accrual or take rate capture from that. Well, you might address that in the where do we go from here section, right? You'll say, hey, over the course of the next 3 to 6 months on the back of the fundraise that we're looking to raise now, we're working on unit economics. And these are the specific levers, the specific action items within those levers, and the specific impact that we hope to have that will ultimately drive 10%, 15, 20% take rate. That's just an example, but my point is use this section to address some of the major concerns that could have come up about your business and where it stands. You should show the path to a real business, right? Especially if it's still sort of work in progress, right? In the broader journey of, starting off with just a story and a team, to a story, a team, and a product, to a story, a team, and a product, and some early traction, to all of that plus a business model, to all of that plus a business model and a sustainable go-to-market engine, to an enduring business. Show that path, not necessarily like semantically, not necessarily step by step, but you get what I mean, right? The objective is building a long-term enduring business, and you see a viable path to get there. Finally, again, the icing on the cake, this is why you are the right team to achieve this vision. So let's see a couple of examples. So this is the vision, milestones, targets example from a company called Locad. So Locad is a cloud warehouse provider in Asia. What they do is they provide warehouse management software as well as basically on-demand warehousing for brands and merchants. And so their closing section might go something like this. You've heard about the market, you've heard about our product, you've seen it, and you've seen what we've achieved so far. Our longer term vision for Locad is completing the democratization of e-commerce, just like Shopify has done for the front end, enabling mom and pop users to create digital storefronts. We want to provide that for the back end, the supply chain of e-commerce, in a twofold fashion. First, we move towards an open logistics platform. And second, we create various expansion opportunities on top of that logistics platform, like embedded fintech or premium SaaS features. The vision is really 80-1-1. What does that mean? We want to cover 80% of the population with single day shipping at the cost of $1 per order, right? For any merchant, any brand on any sales channel. And what we hope to do in the short run is follows. We continue to push on revenue through brand acquisition and internationalization of sales. We'll grow our territory footprint, especially in core markets like Singapore and Australia. We plan to increase our capacity at the individual warehouse level and also acquire new warehouses. And of course, we'll continue to push along our product development lifecycle. In terms of the specific metrics we hope to achieve, let's say year on year from now to next year, we want such and such ARR growth, an increase in brands by XX, and eventually reach the Series A milestones in 2022. I'll give one more example before we close here, guys, which is less about the closing section and more about how a competitive landscape and a team page could look, right? And again, I'll look to ScanPay, the company we visited prior in the QR payment space for this example, right? So this is obviously the competitive landscape. There's a few different ways you can go about this. There's the classic 2x2, which I'm not a big fan of. There's the model or the setup that's a little bit more common now, which is like check marks. It's me and my competition on the horizontal axis. the most key offerings on the y-axis. And lo and behold, I'm all green checks and my competition has some deficiencies there. That's another example. But I think this page is quite unique and quite interesting, right? We're basically saying here's payments is competitive. We all know that. There's many, many players. These names would be familiar to all of you across pretty much every single segment and pretty much every single purchase decision. Where it's more white space is for offline service merchants and in particular SMBs. And we think that we're the right team to build this product. Reason being is we have the perfect combination of global payments expertise. Our leadership team has worked at places like MasterCard, JP Morgan, Bank of America, strong local payment expertise from Pine Labs and others. And finally, and critically important, consumer tech expertise from companies like Amazon, Flipkart, etc. Great, so that's pretty much the end of the presentation, guys. I'll open it up in just a second for questions. Before I do, maybe 3 or 4 closing thoughts to contextualize everything that we just went through, right? I know it's a lot. So first, I think obviously you should be very stage specific when you apply some of these frameworks and models. What I mean by that is a Series A deck will look very different from an A seed deck, which will look very different from a Series B deck, right? At the seed stage or pre-seed stage, maybe there is no traction section, or maybe it's a single page because there's no metrics or maybe even no product to speak of. You should also adjust to today's market. What that means is, I think in 2021, on that spectrum that we've been discussing, it was okay to lean much more heavily into the storytelling aspect, ahead of metrics and ahead of data. That pendulum has shifted far to the other side. And I think now with the macro backdrop, investors are looking for more evidence earlier. And so keep that in mind as you craft your deck. Don't be sloppy. That's just basic hygiene stuff, formatting. I think, I've unfortunately seen also a lot of founders who don't take the deck making process so seriously, and they'll just cobble together something when, even if they're not great deck makers themselves, it's fairly straightforward to engage someone on your team or engage an external provider just to clean things up. Like typos, those types of sloppiness, I think it doesn't set yourself on the best foot forward, as we've been discussing. And then finally, and most importantly, guys, I think keep the goal in mind, right? I think too often do I see founders that take fundraising as the end all be all. Raising this round and the next, that is the objective. That's why I'm doing this business, or at least they lose sight of what is the real objective, I think, for a lot of you, which is to build a long-term enduring business. And fundraising is just one step on the journey to achieving that. And so with that, thank you guys very much, and happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Augie. Before we open up to audience questions, maybe we can ask a couple of general questions that may be relevant for a lot of people. You did mention, based on the current environment, adjust some of the things that you had mentioned. Can you talk about some of the adjustments that early stage founders who haven't launched a product yet should really think about? Because I think some of our members are going to be super early stage founders. How should they position themselves differently now if there are no metrics?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there's a couple things that I would suggest here. So first, I think, even in the case where there, none of the 4 items within the Jackson section that I mentioned, you can put forward, there's always a way that you can be quantitative about the information that you present, right? Let's say you're a pre-seed founder. It's literally yourself, your co-founder, an idea, and a market. Even then, I think there's some ways that you can start to show some of that data orientation that we discussed. It could be very simply the outputs of some of the early validation that you've done. We spoke to 10 customers. This is what they said. You put it together in some streamlined format. Like basically, I would err on the side of being data-driven by trying to quantify whatever information that you have. And I think in most instances, there's something you can point to, no matter how early you are. Like I said, it could be validation of the early PMF when you were thinking about ideas. It could be something else. So that's one suggestion. I think 2, what investors will look for a lot now is, more robust planning on what you hope to do with this capital. So that speaks to more that last section I was mentioning. What are the metrics you hope to achieve? What's the plan for this fundraise? What are the product milestones that you hope to hit? And here, I think like the distinction is before, maybe it was okay to be more focused on growth at the expense of some of these other levers like profitability. And I think that is being rewarded less in today's market. And so tangibly, what you might do is, as you craft your business plan, your 12-month forecast, what you plan to do with this new 18 months of runway, you talk about some of those things, right? You say, hey, of course, like the idea of raising venture funding in general is that you are sacrificing some short-term UE as you grow, but you're not going overboard, right? It's not growth at all costs. And this is the specific business plan we have to eventually achieve profitability down the road. Again, at seed stage, maybe you're overkill, but you get what I'm trying to say. You err a little bit more on the side of UE profitability, at least the path to get there, or at the very least that you have some thinking around it, even in the earliest days. So those are two things that come to mind.
And maybe one final question before I open up to the audience. So audience, please get your questions ready. Based on the fundraising market right now, when do you think things will open up again? Is it Q2? Is it Q3? How should people start thinking about perhaps raising operator angels versus VCs right now? What advice do you have for folks?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'll caveat with, I'm not a macro guy. Like I'm not a public markets guy. So my guess is as good as anyone. But I do believe personally that we are still in for some more pain, especially and maybe until the end of 2023. I think broadly, the effects of rising interest rates have sort of tapered off. I mean, that one's just math, right? Like with interest rates being so high already, and any incremental increase has less effect. And that's maybe 50-60% of the public market price declines that we're seeing already. What hasn't come about and what I'm concerned about is sort of the economic headwinds that are happening, the layoffs, that effect on consumer spending, et cetera. And also more pointedly, I think while we've seen price correction in public markets, the same can't yet fully be true, like be said for private markets, at least from my vantage point, right? A lot of funds have not yet marked down, private funds have not yet marked down their holdings. And so today, LPs are pretty much overweight on the private side because of that dynamic. And so that's a long-winded way of saying I think we're still in for some more pain is my guess. And what that suggests to me, if I was, a founder sitting in your guys' shoes, is I would personally err on the side of trying to raise more and take what I can get, right? I was just on a conversation yesterday with a company that I'm advising, and this question came up, which is, do I take dilutive capital? The terms aren't so great. How much runway should I try to get? And my perspective in this market, if you believe that we're in for 12 months more of pain, is that you should try to take what you can get, and try to basically get that 2 years of runway, even if it costs slightly more than it would have last year.
Great. Thank you, Augie. So I'm going to stop the recording in 10 seconds. Everyone who's joining this via this recording, thank you for watching this. Feel free to email demoday@xoogler.co if you have any questions that get passed to Augie. We're happy to get that answered, or you can message him directly on Twitter. Again, this is one of the prep sessions we have ahead of our demo day at Google's headquarters in London for our APAC demo day on May 25th. So with that, thanks for joining the recording. I'm going to pause it now. And thank you, Augie, for spending your time and educating all of us. We're going to go to audience questions now, which will be unrecorded.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, Chris.